Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube. But the URL is way too complicated, so just go to YouTube and search for Virtual Memories Show. Now, you can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It is yet another hotel-recorded intro. This is probably the third one this summer. I'm in Boston this weekend for ReaderCon, this literary science fiction and fantasy convention. And then I'll be on to the Controlled Release Society annual meeting, which is for my day job and is also in Boston. It is kind of weird that I'm recording so many of these intros on the road this summer. In the past, I used to record them in advance at home and post them when I was on the road, but I got a new MacBook a couple of weeks ago. It's one of those crazy light 12-inch computers, and it's actually made it much easier for me to edit and post an episode while I'm traveling. I record on the regular podcast setup and move the file over to the MacBook. But as it turns out, even though the MacBook is kind of underpowered compared to regular MacBook Pros and stuff, it actually outputs the final MP3 file of the podcast faster than my 5-year-old desktop Mac Mini does, which means I may need to update my office setup sometime. But the upside is I can record while I'm traveling, move everything over here, do all the processing and editing, and put it out the door instead of having to rush through stuff while I'm still at home. Anyway, that's inside baseball sort of stuff. ReaderCon was fun. I got in a bunch of podcasts that'll come out in the next few weeks. There's also one I recorded with John Crowley, but I have to hold that until October when his new novel comes out. His new novel is awesome. I got to read it last week in advance of this session, and I was just knocked the hell out. So you'll find out more about that this fall. On the way up, I also got to see my longtime pals Paul DeFilippo and Deb Newton in Providence, which was good. We had a lunch, coffee, and just kind of shot the breeze for a bit, which was nice. I'd missed them. We hadn't really gotten together for a while. And in keeping with that, I guess, I also connected with an old pal from college who lives kind of near here, about half an hour away. And we had nice dinner and talk over the weekend, and that helped a lot. I've sort of been running on fumes for a while now, and I don't think I knew how much I needed to just kind of talk with somebody who's known me more than half my life. That is, besides my wife, there isn't really anyone I talk to regularly. And while doing the podcast is a neat way to get a good conversation and to learn about someone's life for me, it is more about the guest and not me, which is cool. I mean, that's the point. But sometimes I kind of need to talk through stuff and do, shtick and my standard stand-up routine, etc. But it was nice to talk to someone who has known me long enough that I didn't have to explain a lot of things. It was kind of neat just having that shorthand and just having someone else and learning about their life in the process. So, but as they say, enough about me. This week's show features a conversation with Ben Schwartz. Ben is a comedy writer and a scholar, I guess, in L.A. We recorded during my trip out there in June, prior to the trade show I was attending in San Diego for my day job. Drew Friedman connected us because he has this uncanny ability to guess exactly who I'd have a good conversation with. I'm not going to tell you too much about Ben because his bio covers most of the important stuff, and the conversation itself really unfolds in terms of who he is, what he does, and why we're a great fit. But I do want to cover something that's not in the bio, which we'll get to in a second. See, before we met up, Ben sent me a sample of his work, and part of that was a movie script called Home by Christmas. It's about Bob Hope visiting the troops in Korea in 1950, and about the influence that trip had on Larry Gelbart, who was the guy who would develop MASH for TV. It is a dynamite script, and it's been on the Blacklist, which is that annual list of great unproduced screenplays. I read it before we got together, and I was just floored at how good this was. So while Ben's journalism and his scholarly writing is a blast, you should also check out his work at benschwartzy.com, and that's Ben Schwartz with a Y on the end. But he's also a really gifted dramatist, and I'm just really happy Drew got us together and glad that I got to read the screenplay for Home by Christmas. Now here's Ben's bio. Ben Schwartz is a comedy writer and journalist whose work began appearing at Suck.com as Bertolt Brecht, and has appeared in The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Letterman Monologues, the 84th Oscars, The Baffler, The New York Times, on the radio show Wits, and with comics collaborators like Ivan Brunetti, Peter Bagg, and Drew Friedman. To what degree the work is considered journalism or satire depends on the legal circumstances of the moment and how serious your libel suit looks. He is currently on assignment for Vanity Fair and working on a history of American humor between the two world wars, set to come out from Fantagraphics. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Ben Schwartz. So you're really serious about humor?
Yes.
Where did it start? The seriousness and then the humor?
I've always wanted to write humor, and I would say early on I read a book by a writer named Joe Adamson, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo when I was in grade school. And I had no idea how movies were made or that anybody wrote jokes. I just assumed funny people did funny things in front of cameras. And so
did you think there were little people inside the radio also? Or are the only guy who did that as a little kid? Or did you have that too? Or
I did think that every time I listened to a pop station and they would play in Chicago, I grew up, it was WLS, they would play whatever popular songs were big then every hour. And I thought, how did they get all those bands in and out of the studio?
Good. Okay, so you at least
fast?
felt there was something impractical about radio.
And I felt self-conscious when I was 4 or 5 watching the Brady Bunch, because I just thought, well, if I'm watching their family, is somebody watching mine? And I did feel that was very strange. Unfortunately, parents spoil all of those illusions for us and tell us what's going on.
Did they let you linger for a while, though? So anyway, you're reading about the Marx Brothers, a far too young an age.
Well, I started reading the history of it, and which led me to George Kaufman, who I've fascinated with for decades, and he's a big part of the book I'm working on, the comedy history I'm working on. And then when I got to college at Columbia College in Chicago, there was a professor there named Sheldon Patinkin. Sheldon had been he'd been involved with the University of Chicago with Elaine May and Mike Nichols at the Compass Theater when he was like a teenager, and then he was directing shows at Second City shortly thereafter. And he taught a class called Comedy Workshop, where you wrote sketches, you put on a review, a student review, but at the same time, he had you looking at the nuts and bolts of it too. He had us looking at sketches and dissecting them. He had us read Alice in Wonderland, for example, because he pointed out it was the only work he knew of that had an example of every form of literary humor, poetic puns, limericks, ironic humor, parody, everything was in one book. And he had us looking at each one. He had us read Gerald Mast's The Comic Mind, which was, when I read it, again, he was a person who took all of film comedy up to a point, and examined all of these artists, writers, directors, performers, people who could do all three, and broke down what they were doing into. He was an English professor at the University of Chicago who died young, but a brilliant critic. He also wrote a great book on Howard Hawks. And he was able to give these things sort of a context outside of just enjoying them as entertainment for me. So this is by the time I was 19, I'd read all these books. So they had a big influence on how I sort of historicize things in my mind.
Was there a sense of overanalyzing comedy and making it unfunny, or was there always still the spirit of...
I knew so many, that's the other thing I should have mentioned. I knew so many comedy nerds and people in comedy workshop. We all talked about comedy like that. It was, how do you do this? How do you write the joke? Why is the last word of the joke where you laugh? Like, of all the words in the joke, why is it when you get to the last one, you don't really laugh? It's not funny until you get to that last word. Right. Like all these things that are craft. So for us, no. I mean, it's sort of like, to me, it was as if I went to a school, to learn how to become a mechanic. It's like, do they ever get tired of talking about cars? Do the cars become less fun because you know how the engine works? Right. To them, no. To me, when I go to the garage, yes.
Yeah, it's esoteric, magical work. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know what a tire does. Don't bother explaining it to me again.
Were you performing in high school?
I did high school variety shows, but I'm not really a performer.
As I wondered if it had also been wedded to the, doing it on stage also and figuring out.
I did for a while, and then I realized I'm good at this one thing, writing, and the other thing would take me decades to be craft proficient, and I stopped enjoying it too. It became something I wasn't looking forward to. Whereas writing, I love the concepts and the context you're creating when you're writing. So that became much more fun to me and much more exciting than performing.
And what did college progress into?
Well, I was at Columbia College for 2 years, and then my family moved out here. I started college when I was 17, so my family...
Brag, why don't you? I'm just kidding.
So my family moved out here, and I enrolled at UCLA. And so I really focused on writing. I was an English major, an English literature major at UCLA. And that's where I got my BA in English Lit. And that's where college went. But writing screenplays, and I started really writing screenplays after college and got an agent. I worked for 2 years in Los Angeles at different agencies and different production companies. I got a job as a PA on a TV show back then called Baby Boom, which was adapted from the movie. And
was this one with the talking babies, or a different one with talking babies?
The movie was with Diane Keaton.
That's right. Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
The TV show is with Kate Jackson. And I worked on that for a year. I was hired by Charles Shire and Nancy Myers, who I had interviewed while I was in college. I was writing for the college paper, and they were surprised I had the same sort of set of favorite comedies and movies they did. Hawks and Katharine Hepburn and the same people that really inspired them. They like George Cukor and a lot of that sort of classic Hollywood comedy. And so...
How'd you get exposed to that growing up?
I came home from school in the summer one day, and Channel 7 in Chicago was showing Katharine Hepburn Week, and on Monday it was bringing up Baby. And none of her movies after that were as funny to me. I think they showed Philadelphia Story and Holiday after that, but Bringing Up Baby to me was amazing. And then by the end of the week, I think they maybe had the RKO catalog, so they showed all the RKO movies, and her funniest movie by far there is Bringing Up Baby. So it led me to Howard Hawks, who is also a person I talk a lot about in my book. So a lot of this was really formative for me, and I'm still thinking about it. But they hired me as a PA, and from there I worked in different offices and at different studios in Los Angeles. And you'd call it networking, but I think I was too much of a bumbler to really do that in those jobs really well. But I moved to Berkeley after college and wrote my first screenplays and sent one to an agent that I knew in LA who signed me. And then another agent and 2 screenplays later, I sold a screenplay called Furious George to Warner Brothers, and a producer named Sanford Panitch and a guy named Arnold Kopelson, who I never met. Big 800-pound gorilla producer, Arnold Kopelson at that point, so I never met him. Now Sanford Panitch is the big 800-pound gorilla producer.
Does he remember Furious George?
I have no idea. It never got made. I've sold 3 spec scripts that way, which have never gotten made and done rewrites. But so that's
a good way to make a living?
Huh?
Is that a good way to make a living?
It's a frustrating way and an intermittent way. That's why I've started writing journalism as well. Mm-hmm. The journalism gets published, and the joke writing led me to, because I wrote for Billy Crystal on the Oscars 5 years ago, and wrote for Letterman in his last couple of years, monologue material. So it all leads somewhere.
Yeah.
But a lot of my journalism is still about comedy.
Yeah, how did joke writing begin for you? And where did you first start getting paid to write jokes?
I wrote screenplays first, actually. Because Kaufman and Howard Hawks were the guys I admired so much when I was in college, and filmmakers. And Sheldon taught a sketch writing course, but to me, sketch writing is just as hard as writing a screenplay. Mm-hmm. It's really difficult. It's easy for some people and hard for others, whether they're successful at it or not. And I wrote screenplays, and then Billy Crystal's movie producer, Samantha Sprecher, liked some of my screenplays, and I met her. And when Billy announced that he was hosting the Oscars, she had said, "You're really funny, like on Facebook. So you should you should think about writing jokes." I never really did. And so I asked if I could submit jokes to Billy.
Was the Facebook thing because your jokes were too long for Twitter? Or...
Well, no, Facebook was first.
Okay. I just wonder, because, for me, jokes just have to go on and on and on. There's no way I can compress them to 140 characters. So.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It's a certain type of joke. But.
Yeah. And so that's how that happened, which led to writing for David Letterman, and who I also never met. I did it. I just emailed in my jokes, and I would wait and see if they'd show up on the show. Was there a kill fee, or was it just if they get used? No, not for those. No.
It's a whole ecosystem of this stuff I know nothing about. I'm too busy trying to be funny by myself. But
writing jokes is where you're supposed to start, not after you've sold some screenplays. But I wasn't doing anything else, and it was fun.
Yeah.
Like working on the Oscars was something I never figured I'd do, but it was just such a fluke, and it was so much fun working. Billy wrote with us. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of fun doing that. We just bring our jokes in, and he got Letterman's head writers. He got Jon Stewart's head writer. He got the best, top
look at the IMDb credits for those Oscars, because I knew you were involved in that. That was a all-star lineup of writers.
I was incredibly flattered to be there. Yeah. So,
do you learn from being in a room full of funny guys like that? The thing I'd heard back when Conan got the late night gig many years ago was. I think it was Matt Groening who said he can make a room full of comedy writers laugh, and that's really, really difficult to do. So that's why he figured Conan was going to be fine as a TV host. But that's a very small sample set as far as I know.
I found that funny people are actually not so hard to make laugh, but they are in a competitive situation. It depends on the room. Here's a little comedy history. Is Bob Hope really created the first writers' room as we know them, like on SNL. And he intended it to be competitive. He had his writers going out, gave them the topics for the monologue, and he told them who the guest star would be, so their comedy sketch would, and everybody brought in their funniest stuff. And as Mel Shavelson, one of his writers back then, told me, he said, your job is to make the other writers laugh, because if you could do that, Bob would circle the joke and probably use it. And he said his writing partner at that time, Milt Josephsberg, would kick him under the table if he laughed at anybody else's joke, because it made it harder to get your joke on. And he just said to me, now you know how I got my first ulcer. It was incredibly hard in that room. But for Billy's room, it really wasn't. It was everybody's side gig, because they all had full-time jobs writing jokes for other people.
That's what kind of figured it's a different
Billy makes it a fun place.
Mm-hmm. Had you met him previously?
Nope.
Have you stayed in touch at all?
No, I've not stayed in touch with a a lot of people from that couple, but it's sort of like, when you leave a job,
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't. I mean, not that I didn't like everybody, but it's...
Oh, no, I left a magazine editing job after 17 years. I don't talk to a single human being from that office. I'm perfectly fine with it. So I can imagine there's a corollary, even when it's a writer's room coming together for one big gig.
Well, I would say like 4 or 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's friendly. I mean, I'm on friendly terms with everybody. It's a weird thing about show business. It's like, some people I've stayed in contact with for 30 years, other people, it's these are people I knew in high school, who are writers and things now. And then there's other people who you kind of come and go, and but it's a job.
Any geographic preference?
It's misleading because it's fun. So
and pays well-ish.
Yeah. So I mean, but once you move on to something else, working with other people. So.
As far as geography goes, people from a certain region overrepresented outside of people who are, legacy LA, Hollywood.
The weirdest thing was that of all people on that writing staff was Jeff Cesario, who came from my hometown of Kenosha, Wisconsin. So the only 2 comedy writers in the world who are from Kenosha, Wisconsin ended up in the same room. So,
yeah, I'm just imagining.
Yeah, Kenosha was overrepresented, I think, as far as its national population goes. But
I was just thinking of that movie Funny Bones with Oliver Platt and Jerry Lewis, and Lee Evans, who never got enough work. That town where everybody is funny, but
Oh yeah, Blackpool.
Yeah, that was a movie I turned a comedy nerd onto, like a guy who somehow had missed that because it came in that era of DVD, but before we had streaming and before we had rentals, and where the VHS would cost $95 for some reason. So yeah, he'd managed to miss that and only caught up with it a few years ago. And oh my God, where have you been all my life? That was his.
I saw that movie when it came out with a comedy writer, and it was funny to me that with 2 comedians. But I remember what she said was. We came out of the movie and she said, that would be my nightmare, because she's also a comedian. Can you imagine that? You go on stage and then your dad follows you and he's funnier than you? And I was just thinking, no, what a great situation. Like I was thinking how funny it was to see that happen to somebody, and she was horrified by it,
She actually could have to live it, yeah. So what's it like writing for others? And I haven't talked to script writers either in general, but, writing in, especially comedy, in someone else's voice for somebody else's delivery.
I felt like both times that I did that for Crystal and Letterman, I was able to do it. I didn't mind. I'm not a comedian, so I'm not sitting there thinking I should be up there doing that job.
No.
I don't have that. But it's funny. It's hard to do a parody. Like if you're doing a literary parody, it's harder to do that. But if you told me to write like a comedian, I could do it. So I don't know why that is.
Is Borscht Belt the default at all, or you're kind of a little more sophisticated than that?
One thing I've found is that jokes are jokes, and short, fast jokes work. And I don't think the Borscht Belt invented that, but it certainly created a lot of them. So no, I don't think the Borscht Belt. I don't think it's. I argue with people on this about the impact of the Borscht Belt on American comedy. Because I think there are bigger themes and bigger trends that go on.
Does that seg into the book that you're working on, or is that a separate subject we should jump on?
Well, no, I mean, maybe that's a separate subject. But
we'll go with the Borscht Belt first, then I'll ask you about the book.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I just think it's this, it is this style of humor. And it had, people know what it is, but it's not something that I feel has sort of reshaped American humor the way big media does. When radio came along, those short, fast, punchy jokes really became a dominant kind of humor, and it was because of the medium. Most people never went to the Catskills. I mean, a lot of people did, and a lot of comedians did who really loved what they saw there. But you could list 20 comedians, 30, 40, I don't know, that came out of there. But when I look at American comedy, I don't think what they did there is the big shifts.
Like a catalyst for.
Yeah. I mean, when Lenny Bruce came out of there, what he did to change it wasn't the Borscht Belt stuff. It was when he started, the free speech activism and all the language he was using and using political humor about race, religion. He didn't do that in the Catskills.
So transcending the Borscht Belt would be where he made.
And a lot of the funny stuff he did there is part of the act. Like when he still does the impressions and he still does a lot of the shtick he did. But what we know him for was something else. Woody Allen never spent any time up there. It was, I think, a regional kind of humor, the way Southern comics are. And they can get very successful, but I don't...
That's not the same as changing the national psyche.
Yeah, and I don't think... First of all, I can't think of too many comedians who did that all on their own. Even with Lenny Bruce, when he did that, Allen Ginsberg was publishing Howl. Vladimir Nabokov published Lolita. There's a lot going on. It's not just him. Comedians look at him, as an icon. But there's like this bigger trend in American humor, and he represented it in comedy, I think, or a bigger trend in American life that he represented as a comedian.
Do you have a all-time ranking of stand-up comics?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I mean, it's just people I think are hilarious.
Yeah, wasn't sure if there's that nerd thing where you have to have a Mount Rushmore or something.
I don't. I'm really bad at lists. I couldn't list for you. I could list you 10 film comedies that I love, but I don't have...
What's a movie you'll stick with every time you see it when you're scrolling by on cable? Or that you reload every so often and watch if it's not one of those cable rotation comedies? Besides Bringing Up Baby, of course.
It's funny because that's a short list. I was, for some reason, The Godfather, Cabaret, The Searchers. I mean, there's so many that I would, but they're not all comedies. What are the comedies in that regard? I don't know. Let's say besides Bringing Up Baby, I don't know.
Okay.
It's funny.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I apologize.
It's usually when I'm waiting for it, I know a movie's on and I'll wait for a scene I love. That happens with the road movies. So like a Hope and Crosby scene, like there's a barroom scene in Road to Utopia where they're pretending to be these two tough guys that cracks me up every time I see it. There's all sorts of silly stuff like that. But it's, I started to watch the Marx Brothers movies because I'd seen them so many times. I kind of just watched them to see Chico's reactions because he's not the best at that. But watching him play along until he has his line is pretty funny for me now. So it's getting kind of esoteric. Yeah.
You're working on a book about American comedy in the interwar era?
Yeah, and American humor.
I don't mean comedy isn't stand-up. I mean...
set between World War I and World War II. And it covers George Kaufman's theater, Howard Hawks and Ben Hecht in the movies, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, the novelist Don Powell, who I just wrote about in The Baffler, Peter Arno, the cartoonist, and I'm not sure who I'm forgetting. Somebody, vaudeville writers like Al Boasberg and Harry Kahn. And the shorthand I usually tell people is
elevator pitch.
It's why comedians stopped looking like Charlie Chaplin and Groucho Marx and the baggy pants and the funny makeup and the wigs, and started looking like Jack Benny and Bob Hope. Within 20 years, I mean that school of comedy that dominated America for so long disappeared. Really, mainly disappeared. And it's how comedy modernized and urbanized, and how in every other field of American culture, the novels or poetry or theater, people talk about the impact of modernism on those media and those fields. And I want to talk about it with comedy, like the kind of character Jack Benny played. What should have been an unlikable, mean, cheap, miserly guy, ignorant, amoral, which was a hugely popular character that he played for decades. That character, it would have been hard for anybody to have done that before World War I. And after the war, with modernism and the urban attitudes that we had, suddenly a not so nice American who didn't think and talk like Huckleberry Finn or some of the silent comedians like Chaplin, always the good guy, we always knew they had the best intentions at heart.
Underdog, but at least you wish.
Benny's not the underdog. He's really one of the earliest comedians to come along who plays a boss. everybody on his show's his employee, and they can't stand it, which is hilarious. But that doesn't really exist too much before World War I. There's examples of it, but they were never really popular. But with Benny, he's just hilarious. And a lot of the characters Don Powell or Peter Arno create, not the nicest people in the world.
I was going to put in W.C. Fields in that space, too. I'm not as much of a comedy scholar, obviously, but it does seem like someone he's downtrodden in his way, but also mean-spirited towards others.
Well, he adapted to this kind of humor at certain points, but he can go to like absurdist styles, vaudeville styles. He's not one character.
Sure.
And so I do talk about him because he touches on this in movies like It's a Gift, or I think The Bank Dick. But then but there's usually a saving grace to his character. Mm-hmm. You find out he really does love his kid, or he really is a decent guy down deep. Whereas Jack Benny, no.
Yeah, just a mean-spirited, terrible person. Yeah.
Well, he's not evil, but he's not so great either. They're Babbitts, Babbitt and Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. I talk about too, and it's just. There's a period of American comedy. There's a book I love, Constance Rourke's American Humor, and she ends on Babbitt. And I looked at that book when I first read it. Another one of the books about American comedy and humor is that I'd love to write the sequel to this book, where it all takes off after World War I. When Babbitt comes along, and the people who kind of lead up into that. Robert Benchley did a lot of humor like this. The early New Yorker had a lot of it. And so that's really what it is. What happened to, when we had novelists like Fitzgerald and Hemingway.
How much did you have to steep yourself in modernism and other aesthetic forms and areas in order to work on?
I've always been interested in this period, I knew where to look, but I did have to read a lot. Yeah. I look for parallels in their work and their characters where often you see a character that's in a drama that with a slight twist is suddenly very funny, and like Jack Benny's character would have been a dramatic bad character in any number of novels, as sort of a middle-class businessman who's not so nice, but he would have always learned a lesson to be a better person. Yeah. There's always a Huckleberry Finn to have educated him or given him some morality lessons. And when you see Benny, who I think is actually a rather profound comedian, he's never treated that way, but I will write about him that way, is because he's beset by these people. He doesn't care, which I find hilarious.
It's a good way of framing it.
Yeah. And he is... if you see him in a movie called Hollywood Review, which is not a great movie, but there's two scenes in the movie, one with Buster Keaton and one with Laurel and Hardy. And Benny is the MC of the movie. It was MGM's attempt to bring a vaudeville show to the screen. And there's these two fascinating scenes with Keaton and Laurel and Hardy who are doing that kind of classic American humor, which they were amazing at. And then Benny is... at the beginning of their scenes, he comes out, and at the end of their scenes, you realize he's staring at them in the way the villains stare at them in their movies. The way Bud Jamison or Vernon Dent would stare at Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel in their movies, just like annoyed, impatient with them, thinking they're idiots. But now the perspective is from the other guy's point of view of having to deal with these people. Mm-hmm. And that is why I think so much of the genius of Jack Benny. And I don't use the word lightly. I will be making my case for him as.
Do you see him as worthy of a standalone book?
There have been several, mostly written by his friends, but there is one coming out, a good one, I believe. I haven't read the final book, but another comedy researcher who's helped me and I've helped her, Kathy Seeley. Professor Kathy Seeley, and she's doing a book called, I don't want to give the title because I forget.
Oh, it's okay. I'll put it in the show notes.
It'll be coming out through University of California Press this year. And she's doing a really finely researched look at his career. And so I haven't read the whole thing, so I don't know if she's not approaching it the way I approach Benny. I'm doing 3 or 4 chapters in my book. I'm trying to cover this whole movement, this whole wave of comedy.
How much historical research was involved in this, and how much is more the literary theorizing?
Quite a bit. Because one thing that frustrates me with a lot of comedy history that I read is that the story exists in a vacuum. It's either a biography of a comedian, or someone will write a book like film comedy, or they'll pick their theme, like the comedy teams, the famous comedy teams, or they'll do that.
But this is more social and aesthetic.
Right, because these comedians are drawing on something. And even if it's somebody like, Bob Hope obviously is a topical comedian. Every single show has topical jokes from that day's newspaper. But Jack Benny, too, is, his show takes off in the Great Depression. Why? Why then? Why did he skyrocket during the worst days of the Great Depression? I try to create the picture around him of what his character meant to people who were out of work at that time, listening to this guy who's a jerk, boss, cheap, and not so nice, and the frustration in his employees and what that means to them. So I do that with quite a few of these people, because I feel that the writing around them usually doesn't include that. What was the president saying that week that, Benny might make an allusion to, that, or Bob Hope especially could just allude to something in a joke and it will get a big laugh. Well, why is that? What was going on? And it really, when you can see them engaged in their times, you understand. You can't always explain why something is funny, but you can explain why people could understand that character, why it was so relatable, if you use that word, why they can see that person in their lives, or what does that person represent. And so the historical research has been really important to it. From the 19th century, where I spent some time trying to talk about what American humor was, and then what it becomes, and how actually both the traditional and the modern exist at the same time.
Yeah, there tends not to be a sharp.
No, there wasn't. This was just a new way to do it. And, Will Rogers didn't change the way he was doing anything. Chaplin didn't really change. It didn't affect them. Chaplin's engagement with some of these people is really fascinating. I'll get into that. Because he didn't like what they were doing, but he saw comedy popularly shifting. So what was he going to do? And then, how someone like Robert Benchley, who was a great comedian, but also a great critic of comedy and wrote a lot about, he worked as a theater critic and a literary critic for a long time, and then a critic of media when he started the Wayward, I believe he started the Wayward press column, or took it over at the New Yorker, and really made it a substantial media criticism. So he was always looking at things like that, and incredibly funny.
Did you run into any points where you felt, holy shit, this is getting so much bigger than I thought it was going to be when I first proposed it?
That is a common theme in my email back and forth with my editor, who sort of said, where is this? But then I began sending him the chapters and say, look how involved this is.
Did you sneak in a chapter of Benjamin's arcade projects or something like that? Just to
I didn't. My endnotes have become, so involved. He sees it and he realizes it's a real history book. It's not just sort of a nostalgia
pop culture.
book.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, or a pop culture kind of a look at this period. I've done extensive interviews with people when I started the project, who are still with us. And also a lot of my research, when I wrote articles about comedy for the Writers Guild magazine before this, where I was interviewing comedy writers like Sherwood Schwartz, who was 89 when I met him. Larry Gelbart, who's hitting 80 or in his early 80s. I remember interviewing within a couple of weeks Mel Shavelson, one of Bob Hope's first writers, Sherwood Schwartz, Mort Lockman, and then Larry, who started out when he was 16. And I said, I got to say, even at this late day, you're still the kid in the room. Because he was still a little, thank God those guys were with us so long. So the interview time and the research time has been much more than I ever thought it would be.
To me, it's just the way you describe it, the social history aspect of it makes it seem as though it could be unending if you wanted it to be unending. You could keep, uncovering.
Well, it has. I've been
Yeah.
told I've over-researched. I mean, I've been reading. I was reading a collection of Walter Lippmann columns to try to
Contextualize humor.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then I was kind of thinking, okay, this is going to work, but I want to publish this before I'm 80. So
You could save the material for, well, not the sequel, but you can spin it out into screenplay, novel, something,
well, my interviews with Larry Gelbart turned into a screenplay,
which I read and enjoyed the living hell out of the screenplay.
Home by Christmas, that was on the blacklist a couple of years ago.
I'm just kidding. That's
No, the blacklist is good now. It's good to be on the blacklist. 1950, not such a good thing.
the yet to be produced screenplays that really should be produced.
Yeah, it's sort of like an industry poll of screenplays that people really like, and I was really honored to be on it. And my screenplay was about Larry Gelbart told me a lot about working with Bob, but specifically a 3-day trip he took to Korea with Bob in October of 1950, which had a big impact on him developing MASH for TV. And the script was really about the 3 days they spent there, because they actually, like, not sort of a Hollywood mishmash of history, but in real life, they got there the day the Chinese army really invaded and attacked American forces in late October, and instantly went from a lunch with MacArthur himself, who was telling him, if we're going to win, our boys will be home by Christmas, to landing on the ground in Seoul and realizing, this is crazy. This is not what we were told it is or what anybody thinks it is at home. And so for the next 48 hours of USO shows Bob was doing, the argument among his writers really was, what can we really say? Because the real bond between Bob and GIs back then was that he would say how horrible the war was going. He was very honest. We think of him as sort of a cheerleader from the military. He really wasn't. They challenged him quite a bit on things he wanted to say and censored his broadcasts and shows. People don't know that about him because he was 100% behind the war effort when we got into a war. But the jokes he did, he was very honest about. And what the military didn't like got cut out of broadcasts and television shows. But one-on-one with the troops, he said what he thought. And so they didn't want to lose that. That meant a lot to GIs. That's why he had the credibility he had. Plus, he really went. He really went to the front. He really spent time in those wounded hospitals, which are heartbreaking, the guys he was talking to, what they'd been through. And so he wasn't going to jeopardize his credibility with these guys. So what could they say? What's funny when the Titanic's sinking? What do you say to the crew? And that was the dilemma. That's what the script's about. And those stories come from Larry. So that's how comedy, nonfiction leads into comedy fiction.
Reminiscent, but not derivative, of my favorite year, which I've always enjoyed, but
a favorite comedy of mine. Speaking of one that I don't turn off.
That's my wife and I saying that if we're clicking by, well, my favorite year is on. We've got to catch that.
Yeah, and it definitely in that spirit. I actually years later interviewed Mel Brooks for my book as a GI who saw Bob Hope several times during World War II. Yeah, I saw him. Mel, I mean, it's funny when you talk to him. He's obviously the funniest human being on earth. But when he talks about the war, the jokes stop because it's still one of the most terrifying points of his life. And so we talked a lot about Bob and his impact on GIs, because Mel got him. I mean, Mel was there. Larry was a fan during World War II who went to work for Bob Hope when he was 18. But Mel was there when he was 18, it was 1946 or 7, something like that. But Mel was right there as a GI during World War II in Europe. And so saw it, felt it, got it, the whole thing. And so all of this really helped with that script.
Who did you have the biggest holy shit moment with in terms of, I can't believe I'm interviewing X, Y, or Z? Or did you get over that relatively easily? because everybody's Joe to me. But, sitting down with Clive James is a little bit nerve-wracking for a number of reasons. Harold Bloom I was a little nervous about. But.
Yeah, well, those guys are intimidating because they're intellectuals who don't mind correcting you and pointing out they're very
no, you shallow idiot.
What are you walking into?
But in terms of oh my God, I cannot believe this is the person I get to sit down.
When I was in college, I worked for the UCLA Daily Bruin, and within a year or two, I had interviewed or met William Hurt and Kevin Costner and Brian De Palma, and all these people were making movies in the 80s that they wanted a college audience to come see. So when you work at a big campus like UCLA, that's their primary target. And so I interviewed Carl Reiner back then, and I interviewed quite a few people. And so I kind of got over I'm interviewing somebody famous thing. William Hurt was a little nerve-wracking because he was, back then, he was at the peak of his stardom. He was accepting an award at UCLA, and I got to interview him. I interviewed Bob Hope when I was in college. He came to UCLA to kick off the homecoming or something that year. And I wasn't thinking about any of this back then, so I didn't know. I should have asked him about Al Boasberg and how much he paid him per joke in 1929, because that would become the most important question in my life.
If only you had that time machine.
Yes. So wow, that's, let's see. It's not the fame of the person. It's when I'm looking for something in a story and I want to talk to them about a specific moment. Like I interviewed Frances Langford, literally in the last weeks of her life, and she was so generous with her time. And she was Bob Hope's singer during World War II, but she was there. She was in the room when the news broke that August of 43 that General Patton had slapped 2 soldiers and his career was really in jeopardy. She was in the room, which is a big scene in my book, when Patton is trying to get Bob Hope to go on the radio and defend him. And Bob never did and wouldn't do it.
Which also becomes a plot point in the screenplay.
He's not their mascot. And Patton could not get that out of him. Bob would be the first to say he was a great general, but he wasn't going to defend him for that. Mm-hmm. And he criticized him later. Which I talk about in the book, the gutsy things he said against Patton publicly in a big forum. But he said it funny because he's Bob Hope. So he made his point in a great way. But, to hear Frances talk about him, Frances Langford disagreed with Bob. She thought he should do it. Mm-hmm. They had a big disagreement because Patton had this is the core of Bob Hope during World War II. Patton and his whole school of thought of how to lead men from West Point, these guys who graduated West Point before World War I, and they were leading this army of young men who had been called up incredibly fast to have a standing army of like 16 million people during World War II. And you had this West Point leadership, some of whom were adapting to this, trying to understand these young men and better lead them into this war, right? And so I empathize with Patton. He wasn't as good at it as Dwight Eisenhower or Omar Bradley. He did try to adapt. Like when you hear Patton cursing all the time in public, that's his way of being real with the guys, but slapping them was also his way. And that really, they admired him no end for the results he got. But that was a big point of disagreement of what American men were going through in World War II. That's when we start talking about PTSD. That's when we start talking about the psychological damage of war that Patton's generation, he personally didn't believe it existed. It was called cowardice. And so,
well, to be fair, World War I had a soldier's heart. They had the same, a similar concept. But yeah,
but he would not accept it. Whereas there are other parts of the military leadership at that time that were beginning to accept it. And that divergent point of view is where of that leadership versus those teenagers and young college men who are being drafted is the heart of Bob Hope's humor. And so that meeting here's what got me about Frances, though, talking to a witness to that history that I care so much about. Yeah. That's what I was nervous asking her questions, because she saw it. Yeah. You know what I mean? Which to me, this is as big as, the Battle of Gettysburg for me. Bob Hope versus George Patton. Okay. And it was versus because Bob wouldn't do it. And so the historical research of here's what I need to write about that scene. I need to learn about PTSD, the culture of it, how the military treated it back then, Bob's view of it, because he talked about it, Francis's view of it, Patton, the impact on all of it, why that moment mattered so much. And it echoes throughout Bob's humor throughout the war after that.
Go on.
Oh, so no, go ahead, you please.
I was going to say, do you see this as stretching beyond the compass of the book? Do you see this as something that's going to lead to more nonfiction from you down the line?
I am writing nonfiction anyway.
That's true. You can adapt this into journalistic pieces too.
Yeah, so. I find it's. Well, that is the journalism. This what I'm talking about.
Okay, I didn't know if it was an end point of the book itself or.
No. This is a the final chapters in the book where I'm talking about this modernist humor that Bob is doing. He's confronting a guy who comes from a much more traditional classic American culture, and in George Patton, not a funny man, and Patton's problems with the new humor in the form of Bill Malden, the wartime cartoonist, the great wartime cartoonist, and his epic meeting with Patton, which echoes what happened with Bob. So all of this comes together for this story. And the final chapter of the book is really Bob Hope during World War II.
Did you find, we'll say not unsung heroes, but forgotten comedians that when I recorded with Ben Modell, the silent movie accompanist, because everybody should know a silent movie accompanist, he's also done a lot of historical research and work, and because he works on identifying silent shorts that the Smithsonian turns up. All these people who were the second biggest thing in the world 80 years ago and are now completely forgotten to history. Did you come across that sort of world at all? Like people who seemed as though they should have been enormously significant, but just kind of faded?
I do, because there are vaudeville writers like Al Boasberg and Harry Kahn, who I write about, that worked with the Marx Brothers or Jack Benny. So their names pop up because they work with such famous people. There are comedians who were very influential back then whose names we don't know. But I find a lot of these people, they hit on something and they're really good at it. But there's somebody like Jack Benny lifting it up.
Yeah.
And so
it's usually not accidental that those guys turned out to be, they were the second Marcel Perez. You were good, but you were no,
And Jack Benny came out of a circle of comedians. Some were friends and some who weren't. But Phil Baker, Frank Fay, Ben Burney, Julius Tannen, and Benny were some of these comedians that were going on stage in suits and just talking to an audience. They resemble modern stand-up comics, although I'd argue none of them really, they didn't really become the streamlined joke comic until later. Bob Hope's really the guy who perfected that, but he was influenced by them. Bob Hope would say Frank Fay, Phil Baker, and Jack Benny. Mm-hmm. So much, though, because he worked with Al Boasberg, that he was compared to them. So too much. He had to break away and become his own kind of comedian.
That brings us back to the Harold Bloom thing, with the whole, overcoming your precursors. But go on. Yeah.
And these, all of these secondary figures in Bob Hope's life, although Jack Benny was certainly became equally successful, how did that influence Bob Hope? Why was it a problem for him being seen as a Jack Benny imitator early on, as he was? That school of comedy was so new then that because he was doing it like Benny, people assumed he was a Jack Benny imitator when he really had Jack Benny's writer, Al Boasberg, at the same time. There was also Phil Baker, who was, in my opinion, really the first of this school. Phil, hugely successful. I mean, his name doesn't stay with us because he didn't really make movies and he never got into television. But, I mean, a top star in Broadway reviews, had a hit radio show for 20 years, invented the comedian game show host idea because he was the host of Take It or Leave It. Groucho became a comedian game show host. Drew Carey today a Monty Hall. It's all, now I'm not writing a book about that, but somebody should.
Well, that could be the next topic.
Yeah. But Phil was the most, in my mind, the most innovative comic coming out of World War II. Every comic who's the smart ones, the ones who saw, not the smart, I want to say that because there are a lot of smart comedians who just didn't do that kind of comedy, but the young guys coming up were looking for the new thing. Phil was it. And there were other influential comedians in that period, but he's the one they keep citing, the comedian's comedian, the way comedians today talk about Bill Hicks.
Yeah.
You know, the guy they all look to and say, like, admire for the great moments of his career. And with Phil, he inspired this kind of comedy. He was a smart ass, sarcastic. He didn't tell jokes the way other comedians really let you know, I'm telling a joke now. It's a story. Really hitting the punchline. He loved to walk right up to the edge of the stage because you could, if you're in vaudeville, there was no PA system when he started. So that way you could talk to more of the audience like a person and talk to the people in the audience. And he had an accordion and, he started a bit called The Boy in the Box, which you still see on the Muppet Show with the two hecklers, Statler and Waldorf.
Two of the greatest characters ever made. But go on. Yeah.
Well, that's Phil's act. He started working with a guy named Sid Silvers, and Jerry Lewis did a movie about them with Dean Martin called The Stooge. And, like them, but couldn't name them because it was lawsuits and things. And Sid Silvers wrote the movie though. And, he was innovative in so many ways, and so many people saw his success and started imitating him, some of whom he liked, like Jack Benny, were very close friends, some of whom he didn't, like Milton Berle, who sort of couldn't take the ideas and do his own thing, was doing a little too close to Phil. Benny evolved it, because he was always creative. He was always happy to work with writers. So it was improving what he did. But these secondary figures, I don't think many of them, or some of them I feel were robbed out of things. Harry Conn, certainly co-creator of the Jack Benny Show, should have been as wealthy as Benny, in my opinion. Should have been like the way Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld were partners. Mm-hmm. Should have been that. And he wasn't. But Al Boasberg had a phenomenal career, and so I have come across a bunch of these in the cartooning world, and just surprising whose show influences who, even though this is something I'll talk in the book, but the big impact of Beatrice Lillie, the great British comedian, the huge impact she had on American political satire. And it's not something, but now I can talk about it when I get there. I will not reveal the whole story of this incredible mystery. Yeah. What happened?
Dare I ask, you had a timeline to finish the book? Or do you have a contract to finish the book?
I have a contract and a patient publisher. Okay. So I am a couple chapters away from the first draft. Yeah. And in the next year, I will then begin the real revisions and the indexes and the full endnotes and everything like that.
And script doctor to punch it out. I'm kidding. So.
Yeah. But that's the other thing is, pitching movies and pitching TV shows and getting work that really pays the bills.
Yeah. Do you hang in the comedy nerd community, or is it pretty much, lone wolves wandering around kind of learning what they can?
No, I do. Let's put it this way. I know them all. I know a lot of them because we have so many similar interests. You mentioned before we started really Cliff Nesteroff, who wrote a great book, The Comedians. I know you're going to interview in the future Jerry Beck, who's written a lot about animation, and Joe Adamson, whose books, he recently retired from the Motion Picture Academy as one of their archivists. He's written any number of great books on this. So, and then you meet people because the best way to do it is to trade information. You're very rarely working on something that's directly competitive with somebody. So, people researching Jack Benny and Bob Hope have been hugely helpful to me, and hopefully I have been to them too.
I noticed, in addition to the comedy DVDs, we've got the modernist and postmodernist literature. and a shit ton of great underground, alternative comics. Do they all kind of fit into a single continuum for you, or are those discrete aspects of your life?
I do think sometimes, like, if I was going to write a book about after World War II, how does all this tie in? Where does, I'm someone who is equally in love with Jack Benny as I am with Dan Clowes's comics, or, the Hernandez brothers.
Although the two Spanish editions of Kaz's Underworld collection kind of baffle me, but that's okay.
My wife designed Kaz's. She's a graphic designer. She designed Kaz's magnum opus, his Underworld collection. So 24 years.
The artist, the graphic designer for the book, and the guy who did the introduction. I recorded with Patrick McDonnell a couple of months ago.
Oh, okay.
One of Kaz's schoolmates from SVA. So I've got the whole package now. That's awesome.
Well, he interviewed Bridie, my wife, because she designed the book and made it look as great as it is.
Mm-hmm. So that explains why they're on the shelf. Then the Spanish language.
Let me credit those to my wife, because she used those, and I can't read Spanish.
I think Kaz transcends language, but anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yes,
so.
Actually, behind you is an original, one of Kaz's, one of my favorites of his. So no, I don't really see, because as I say, like the period I'm writing about, there's this 19th century kind of purely American humor that exists and still exists, and this new way of this modernist way of creating humor that took off after World War I. So they coexist. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'd have to really look at some of the stuff I love, because I find I love Laurel and Hardy as much as I love Richard Pryor or Lenny Bruce or any of the comedians I'm talking about during the interwar period. I like funny people. They make me laugh. They're getting their point across in a funny way.
See, when I grew up, we were Abbott and Costello, and it was people who either liked Laurel and Hardy or Abbott and Costello, and then the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges. They weren't Venn diagrams. They never overlapped. If people like the Three Stooges, they didn't get the Marx Brothers, and vice versa. Neurotic Jew that I am, you can guess which side I fell on.
Yeah, there aren't many people. Usually it's a comedian who says something stupid and they're in the news, and I think, what an idiot. And then they're not funny to me for a while.
Women can't be funny.
Yeah, one of those types. Yeah. And, it's usually their real life or something where they do something horrendous.
Yeah, I think this was more like sports rivalry for some reason when I was a kid.
There's always that, like, who's funniest. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I will side with the Marx Brothers on that one. I don't think there's one kind of funny, and I don't think that there is one way to do it. That's why the Sunshine Boys is always so funny, especially like, K-words are funny. It's like, okay. To you, they are, and you make them funny, but not to everybody. So, that's one thing that's really fascinating about America is so many, as it continually diversifies and you have so many different voices now just getting on Twitter or getting a comedy special that couldn't do that 20 years ago. It's fascinating where comedy comes from.
Do you see comedy as a key to understanding America, or just in as much as it unlocks pop culture and that gives you a greater perspective?
It's one way. I mean, it's one way to get to it. It's how I look at American history.
Yeah.
I've started to look at it's my window into it. Other people could do music or politics or, any number of ways. I feel like this country is so big and so crazy all the time. There's no one way and there's no one America, So it's for me, it's like, it's the way I do it, and understanding this period. Why did all of this stuff make me laugh? Like, when you talk about the continuum of it, if there's a theme, what is it about Groucho that makes me laugh so hard, or Howard Hawks' comedies, or Robert Benchley's stuff in the early days, or whoever it is? There are a lot of them are coming from a certain period. Why? Is there anything linking them? And you talk about an odd way to get to this. Al Boasberg, the comedy writer, was the one who did, because I wrote a piece on him in 1999. He died in 1937. He was born in 1891, which is, comedy nerds argue about this, but when I started this project, it was so long ago, you could still get death certificates and birth certificates. So I can say, I want to say definitively, when you talk about the comedy nerds, I can definitively show he was born in 1891. I can't wait to get that out there. Maybe this, I don't know if that's a selling point for the book.
They'll set my podcast on fire.
Yes.
Well,
get ready for the hate mail.
Well, seeing those Crazy Cat collections behind you reminds me of have you read Michael Tisserand's biography of
Yeah, I wrote about it for the
Oh, that's right, you did.
Books.
Yeah. With that great opening about the guy who had to write the biographical sketch, but this can't be right. It says colored on the birth certificate, and and the little things you can find when you could actually hunt down birth certificates once upon a time. Mm-hmm. So you're saying about Boasberg?
Well, he was the first writer Jack Benny ever hired, first writer Phil Baker ever hired, first writer Bob Hope ever hired. He was the first writer Milton Berle ever hired so that he could sound like Phil Baker, which, to be fair, is why Jack Benny hired him. They saw the success early on of Phil Baker. Burns and Allen, first writer George Burns ever hired. He co-wrote two Marx Brothers movies, Day at the Races and Night at the Opera, 4 Keaton films, co-wrote The General, co-wrote Battling Butler, 2 of his talkies as well, and Free and Easy and Doughboys, and wrote and directed shorts for Leon Errol, wrote for Benny all throughout his career, but in this pivotal 1936 to 37 season when Rochester first joins the show, so much of the Benny world kind of first appears in that season, and a lot of the future tone of the show, in my opinion, is really established there. Although it's not so cut and dry. I mean, there are other people contributing, not to mention Jack Benny himself. And so, but I saw in Boasberg this person all of these people came to. And he did really well. I mean, he was making a lot of money at MGM. Irving Thalberg liked him before he ever met the Marx Brothers. I just wrote this long essay about him for a book called The Film Comedy Reader. And it's about 15,000 words on this obscure joke writer. But through him, I began to see this modernist sensibility. These characters were not nice people compared to the other people he's writing about. It's why he didn't work out so well with Keaton. Keaton eventually fired him because Keaton is a classic American comedian in so many ways. He's the good guy we like who wins the girl and saves the day in the end. And not in his shorts. So I talk about those that he made with a guy named Eddie Klein. But in his features, he does. And Boasberg didn't really mesh with him very well. Boasberg is very dependent on verbal stuff. And so he wrote a lot of the title cards. But his whole sensibility was of a much more sardonic, sort of, is cynical the word I'm looking for? Skeptical view of the comedian's character. Was he so nice? Why was he doing all these things? Why was he doing this for the girl? Just because he had a crush on her or because he wants to sleep with her? Yeah. You know, Jack Benny wants to sleep with women. Groucho wants to sleep with women. Buster Keaton, I don't know. Yeah. He wants to get married. We know he wants to get married, and that seems to be it.
But I did name my first 2 dogs after Rufus T. Firefly and Otis B. Driftwood.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I was just thinking of a Rufus over your head for the great Groucho Marx.
Yes. And so through Boasberg's odd career, I began to see the modernist take, and it began to unlock for me. And so that's the way I began to see that period.
Have you read Inside the Whale by George Orwell?
No, I haven't.
Oh. You should read that.
Okay.
I'll email you about it afterwards. But ostensibly an essay about Henry Miller and Tropic of Cancer, but it's really an analysis of English letters from like 1900 to 1940. I believe I have read it because I have read where he talked about Tropic of Cancer, but it's not coming in the Clive James way we talked about where you forget everything you've read. Yeah. Or in the James, and I forget which essay it is, but it somehow devolves into Richard Burton's Hair in Where Eagles Dare, when it's supposed to be about something completely different, and just turns into this ridiculous coif the guy had in where he's supposed to be an undercover commando or something. But yeah, the Orwell essay, the parts of it that deal with modernism and what came after sound as though they would echo a lot of what you're trying to get at, or they might support what you're trying to do. If you have a collection of essays by George Orwell, it's in there. It's about 30 or 40 pages.
Yes, I do. And
Good. I won't have to send you a copy. Great.
Okay.
Because, all I want to do is help other people have more to read than they thought they were going to have.
And that's one thing I need for this book, more research.
Yeah, thank God.
Right? But yeah, these people are my way into American history and American life. And, Boasberg and Benny were so in sync with their humor, from 1923, I think, on, and until Boasberg's death in 1937. Might have been 1922. I don't know. But off the top of my head, but very early on, as soon as Benny could buy jokes from him, he did, and and as did Hope and the rest, and so to Boasberg's life and what I could gather from his remaining relatives who were very elderly when I met them, and what they remembered of him was a big help. But from when I began to realize this was the difference between a Jack Benny and a Charlie Chaplin, I began to see that in a lot of other comedy. And so that's
where it all comes from.
Yeah.
And your history with comic books, with the Hernandezes and all that, was that again, it doesn't have to be any part of this, but what was your experience?
Oh, well, I've interviewed them
I just
a couple of times.
In your fandom of comics. Like, where did that begin for you?
It's funny, but I probably first came across Love and Rockets at comic book conventions when I was really young, and I was a Marvel fan, so it looked kind of crazy to me. And I would look at, and I didn't really get it because I was selling. Because I got older, Jaime's stuff too, because I was getting into punk rock, and Jaime, his comics were directly related to punk rock. Gilbert he had the Palomar stories, and he created this whole world.
And you hadn't read Garcia Marquez yet, so you couldn't get to Beto.
He was actually just Gilbert was just over my head at that point. Where Jaime, I could relate to the pop culture angles. Jaime also, they both have a cartoony way of drawing, but you can see Jaime's influence from like Archie comics.
Yeah,
and
Veronica and Betty, if they were Latina punk lesbians. Yeah,
and so he he made me excited to move to LA because I thought I would live, and when I first came out here for college, I ended up living in Venice Beach for a while with my friends from college. And
you go up to Oxnard and drive around hoping to find them?
No, I didn't go up to Oxnard. They came to Hollywood for a reason. But it makes you, that was like an idea to me of what LA was, Jaime's comics, as much as any film noir, any Raymond Chandler novel, any like Sunset Boulevard or anything like that. What's Los Angeles? Anything I saw on TV, Jaime's comics were part of it. And so
you find the Black Flag concert by following the police helicopters.
Well, actually, I moved here. I always tell my friends, bad timing. I left Chicago as Big Black got together and arrived in LA as Black Flag broke up. And so I remember seeing the first show I saw here was actually Henry Rollins doing spoken word, followed by Firehose. Or was it the other way around?
Early 90s, I guess, right?
Late 80s. Or mid 80s, like 86 or 87.
How old are you? If it's not too personal a question to ask in Hollywood.
51.
Okay. I'm sure it's on your IMDb.
Yeah, I should probably hide that. I don't know.
I did have one guest who would not tell me his age. Because he was pitching, not to act, he just had a screenplay based on a nonfiction book. And I asked him in the course of conversation, because I was trying to gauge, our cultural frames of reference, I'd rather not tell you. I said, really? He's like, yeah, it could be a problem because we're trying to sell a script. I'm like, okay, I don't know how this works. I'm, some schlub from New Jersey. I'll let it slide. But really good nonfiction book. I'll tell you about it off mic. But,
okay. Yeah. I don't really, that's a problem, I think, if you want to get hired on a hot sitcom where it's aimed at 20-year-olds, right?
And you've already got an in because you've got the same name as Ben Schwartz, who was on Parks and Rec.
Well, I don't know how much that helps me or him. There's a lot of confusion.
I admit, when you were first proposed to me as a guest, I looked it up. I'm like, That can't be who they're talking about. John Ralphio from Parks and Rec. No, it's got to be another Ben Schwartz. So.
Yeah, he's hilarious. But I have 12,000 followers on Twitter, almost 13,000. He's got 1.25 million. So I do, whenever he has a new movie coming out or something, I get all these new fans.
You got to get the book out in a hurry because they'll jump on it unwittingly, but they'll jump on it.
That's true. I should really I should tone down it. I correct them all the time and say, no, you want this guy. I have to tone that down when the book comes out.
Yeah. The irony is I'm supposed to at some point interview the woman who played his sister on the show, Jenny Slate, because I interviewed her dad, who is a former biotech executive and poet, which fits right up my alley because of the crazy career path I've taken. So when he first connected with me, he sent a little letter of introduction, mentioned in the final paragraph, also, my daughter Jenny just finished her first season on Saturday Night Live, which it was just, wait, the one from Disturbing, the Jonathan Ames show, the first Bored to Death? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she had a bit role on that one, and that's where I remembered her. And that girl's dad is a biotech, whatever. It's the whole world, ties together, and I'm usually on the outside, but everybody else seems to know each other. Contemporary comedy
that I like
and that you keep up with. Are you able to? Again, the proliferation and diversity of it makes it impossible to follow everything. But do you work at keeping up with what goes on comedically?
You kind of have to just to see what's going on. But like the screenplays I'm writing now aren't really dependent on that. I don't need to know the difference between Uber and Lyft. I find the comedy feuds really funny themselves on Twitter.
Funny as themselves. Funny over the fact that two people are fighting with each other.
Well, just how much comedy is sort of just the flashpoint of controversy now. It used to be, it's a rap song or something people are upset about, or some horrendous, object of art that's being displayed. Now it's a comedian makes a joke on Twitter and it goes viral, and it's like everybody's upset about it, and it's sometimes the joke's really offensive, sometimes it's just people are outraged to be outraged. So I don't, but I know, so I don't really follow the newest stuff because I'm not trying to get a job
writing a screenplay for an Amy Schumer, for example.
Right. I mean, a great comedian Amy Schumer, a fan of her sketch show. I never thought in my life I should write for it, but she's hilarious. So when she went on in the first season of Broad City, I just thought that first season of Broad City just killed me. As funny as anything. And so, I don't look for it. I don't feel like I used to be out in comedy clubs more.
I guess that's what I'm asking.
No, I don't go out of my way to do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a big reason to be there because I'm not like sending jokes, trying to get on Jimmy Kimmel's show or something like that. If that was the goal, I would be there all the time pursuing it. But right now I'm writing new screenplays. And also the stuff I'm writing now is not all comedy. And I don't find they need you to be the youngest guy in the room if you're not doing those kind of jobs. If you're writing like, the stuff I'm doing now, it kind of helps to be older, to have more historical background, to have more knowledge, to be, the funny guy doing a topical joke about, Lyft and Uber or something like that. Yeah, you should be knowing these trends and knowing, what Rihanna just did or who just slammed Beyonce. So you need to write a joke about it because it's a big, pop music rivalry or something. That would really be helpful to really care about it. You know what I mean? To really want to know and take a side in what Miley Cyrus just said. Whereas there's, for what I'm writing now, I don't need to. You know what I mean? So, I hope she says nice things about me.
She talks so much shit about you in my DMs. It's terrible. What are you better at writing now than you were when you were even 10 years ago, we'll say?
Everything. My nonfiction is much better because I know how to research it and get to the point of the story much faster than I used to.
In terms of the writing of it or conceptualizing what the point is as you're doing the research?
Both. I mean, I have a better writing style than I did. I mean, I look at some of my old stuff and it feels clunky or slow to me. And I feel like I'm missing important things, but maybe those things weren't important to me when I was doing it, back then. So I do feel I'm better. What I do is more compelling. I don't think I would have gotten whatever work I've gotten from the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Book Forum. I don't think I would have gotten that work when I was 25.
It's a matter of, I don't want to just say reps, but, the repetition of doing this and the practice really.
Also knowing a lot more about what I write about. A big part of selling pieces is having an idea that other people don't have, having a point of view or a knowledge that other people don't have. I mean, I have friends who write a lot about politics and sports. They're so competitive.
I told, back in 2000 or 2001, I told my old assistant editor, whose big dream was to work for Bono someday. Even then I said, you have to find something that no one else is interested in. You can write about U2, but there's going to be, at that time, a bazillion people writing fan blogs about U2. You have to find something they don't care about and, make it your own and do it really well. So, yeah, I can imagine that's doing it for
and that's the great thing about the New Yorker is that they have a wide range of interests. So, like the Peter Arno story I did for Vanity Fair, very few people want to run a big piece on Peter Arno. But I was able to pitch it in a way that made it interesting to Graydon Carter and the magazine that make it also contemporary in a way. What his life was, what his art meant to people. So, that helps. I mean, I'm not a baseball writer, so.
But people are willing to write free about baseball in a way that they're not really writing free about Peter Arno.
Yeah.
Guys will just write their own blogs about, topic X and give 10,000 words on it, whereas what you did required actual research.
Well, the research, and by the way, Vanity Fair funded it too. I mean, it was like flying me to New York, the people I got to interview, the libraries I got to go to. Not have been possible had they not done that. So having an interest outside of a lot of the mainstream helps, but because I don't write about politics and I have nothing to say about it really that 100 people couldn't say better, there's just no point to me doing that. But that's where also you can make a lot more money. You make your living doing that. You can make your living blogging about, politics and sports and music and things, pop music.
If you can get people to read.
I hope you can.
Did you run into or run over or get run over by Michael Maslin at any point when you were both working on the Arno projects, or had he sort of finished his by the time you were doing the Vanity Fair?
I had finished mine a while back because I had been hired years ago to write it.
Oh, okay.
And so it got pushed back. There was sort of a big economic collapse that was in the news a couple of years ago. And so...
topical humor.
Yes. And so that story I contracted to write about years ago. And Michael and I never talked, but we talked to a lot of the same people. Mm-hmm. And I have his book. I haven't read it yet, but he had been working on his book for years and years too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was like turn of the century. I seem to remember when we talked, it was like 2002, 2003 it started. So.
Yeah. And so when I get to, I will be looking at his book when I get to
the New Yorker.
The New Yorker, the cartooning revolution of the mid-20s and Arno's part in that. I definitely will read it. By the time his book came out, right when my story did, I'd been kind of Arno'd out, But I want to read this, all the biographies of these people. I mean, I've read all the Bob Hope biographies and Benny biographies to do these and the histories around them too.
Were you a Hope guy growing up?
No, he was the biggest surprise of this book to me.
That's what I'm wondering, because I never glommed onto Bob Hope as a kid. No. Growing up in the 70s, you're 5 years older than me, but essentially same era.
Yeah, no, he...
Did it come out of the Gelbart conversations?
Talking to Larry Gelbart and his other writers first, because they were really smart, sharp comedy writers. Mel Shavelson and Larry Gelbart were two pretty upfront about their democratic liberal politics. So they could look at Bob as a guy they disagreed with on a lot, but they liked him. They liked his ambition. They knew him when he was ambitious, when he wanted to have the funniest radio show in the world, when he wanted to do the best comedies on screen. And he really pushed and was ambitious and cared. And those movies, he never states in his movies what the movie's about in a blunt way, satirically. But once you get it, there's another layer of funny to them. They were ironic, and there's a lot of what we would call dog whistle words in those movies, which I'll talk a lot about in the book, because they're surprisingly sharp and political in a way you don't expect. An audience at the time would get it. Now we don't, because the topical references
the code
is
different. Yeah,
but his topical joke you get right away. That's obvious, But his takes on the war and journalism during the war and a lot of different things, which are really sharp and satirical. He loved it if you got it, but if you didn't get it, it was okay, because he wanted it to be a successful comedy before he wanted it to be a successful satire. And so, I came away with a lot of respect, much more than I thought, how he created that radio show. It's huge impact on our comedy today, even if people have never heard it. But it's just what became standard off of that show.
Because, I between the screenplay and some of the other stuff you've written on Hope, I just was perplexed, or was wondering whether it was, as a child, I loved Bob Hope, and now I've learned all this about him, or holy crap, in the process of learning all this, I realized Bob Hope was more important than I thought.
I think he did. See, the thing he never did is he never cared about his legacy as a comedian. He has his name on hospitals and battleships and highways and everything, to show that he was a humanitarian, that he was like an immigrant who came to America from England and made it, and he gave back. That's what he wanted you to know. He talks in some of his books about how proud he was of his radio show, but people didn't take that too seriously. With Woody Allen, he loves talking about how much everything. I wrote all that. Those post-war guys like Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce, they want you to know that they did that. And Lenny Bruce was biased against comedians who use writers, where the guys in vaudeville like Bob and Jack Benny, they viewed what the public saw as the most important thing. The idea that they wrote everything, not really important. Finding out that Bob really was a writer, even though he never wanted credit for that, and his writers really respected when he did sit down with them to write jokes, that he could do it as well as they could. He gets put down for that, for not being a writer sometimes, but Letterman didn't write all of his shows. Carson didn't. Yeah. Buster Keaton didn't write all of his movies alone. Jon Stewart didn't. A lot of people. Harold Lloyd worked with a lot of writers. Groucho did. So I think people have a political bias against Bob Hope because of the Vietnam War, which understandable if you were there at the time. But now I think hopefully we can get beyond it, because his life spans,
a much greater
than just the Vietnam War. Yeah.
So last question, we'll go out with something relatively easy. Charlie Hebdo. Just use a nice, non-controversial topic. Where did you stand in terms of, obviously not they deserved what happened, but did you feel in terms of, where do you stand in terms of the type of comedy, the punching down versus...
After it happened, the magazine didn't get funnier. I noticed that. And they had to get a lot of new cartoonists.
So as long as you can make a joke about it, that's what's important.
No, it's insane what happened to them. It was savage. And, just last week we had the incident where the Shakespeare in the Park was only verbally interrupted. Can't equate what happened to Charlie Hebdo with what happened at Shakespeare in the Park. But I don't want to see it get any worse here. Mm-hmm. What happened to them...
I mean, in terms specifically the type of humor and what was some of the arguments against those sorts of, like the Gary Trudeau position.
I think continually their problem is they don't care if people don't get their jokes. People are routinely offended by them. And they don't care. They're not trying to get a laugh. They're not trying to really do that. They're trying to make a really cold or savagely satirical point. Their politics, you can say, well, they're not racist individuals, not in the sense that they hate people, but they're happy to use those racist archetypes in their imagery that has plagued a lot of American comedians who mean to do a good thing in favor of the civil rights movement or want to comment on racism, but they use the same imagery of the racist. And I don't think Charlie Hebdo ever understood that outside of their mainly white male cartooning world, there are a lot of people really offended by that and don't look at them as coming from a friendly source. They're not going to change anything they do. And they're part of a sort of, I forget the name of it now, but it's a 19th century form of satire that was very popular in France. And, we have a 19th century form of satire here that nobody likes anymore and that caused a great deal of pain and not funny misery, which is minstrelsy.
Right.
And people who still adopt that, they do it every once in a while. You see somebody who thinks it's funny,
As Desus and Mero put it, actually, I don't remember if it was Desus. No, it was Mike Yard on Larry Wilmore's show when they had the when is it okay to use blackface? And it was, are you black? No, it's never good. It's never okay.
It's not going to work for you. I mean, so what happened with them? It's that the act of terrorism where those cartoonists were murdered. That's just an act of viciousness that goes outside of any kind of comedy conversation. It's no longer really about comedy any more than it's about comedy when somebody drives a truck into a crowd and murders people. That's not about comedy. That's about terrorism. As far as their aesthetic, I think they're bad at jokes. I think that their point is not comedy. It's not getting laughs out of people. They have a style of French satire that they do, and again, the name of it escapes me. And they could care less. They care about their point, their way. I mean, it's a low-selling magazine. It's always been kind of like a satirical pain in the butt to people. But it's not an innocuous one the way Mad Magazine is here, right? Mad Magazine doesn't offend you in their politics or their takes on race or gender. It's more like, really? You couldn't try harder? It's like the Charlie Hebdo guys, they fail because and when I say fail, like whether you care if the audience laughs or not, whether you make 10 people laugh or 1 million people laugh, whether you care about that or not, they're continually misunderstood. Okay? And if you're misunderstood, then that's your fault as a comedy writer or a cartoonist. There's always, the thing about Charlie Hebdo is, first of all, they're in French, not English, but in France, they're misunderstood quite often. And there's always a Charlie Hebdo explainer. If you need somebody to explain the history of the satirical take you have, your history and your politics on race, and your history and your politics on as a satirical organization from the left and everything that they are. If you continually need that, you're doing something wrong if you want to call yourself a satirist or a comedian. There's no, Richard Pryor and Lenny Bruce managed to offend a lot of people, but they did it where people understood what they were. They hated a lot of what they said, which is another question. Charlie Hebdo continually confuses people why they're using those weird images of African Americans and Muslims. And so that's my fault with them is craft. They don't really do it well. But there is a cartoonist who came out of there that did a book that won the LA Times book prizes when I was judging the contest. He's an Arab cartoonist who now his name escapes me too. But he did a great book about growing up between Paris and the Middle East, because his father was Syrian and they lived in Syria and Libya.
Siad Ratouf. The first book came out last year. Something about the modern Arab. It's a 4-part thing.
Yeah. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And this guy, he came out of Charlie Hebdo too. He drew for them. But this book is so much smarter and so brilliant at looking at so many sides of the Arab world, from being an Arab growing up in Paris, in this cosmopolitan Western city, to moving to rural Syria, And so they could do better if they wanted to, and they don't want to. I guess I could go on quite a bit about it.
Yeah.
Charlie Hebdo, that's my thing with them, is like, I look at what would be considered offensive humor all the time on Twitter. Twitter is like the best source of political humor now. It's better than, in my opinion, it's better than any show on TV. It's funnier every day. I mean, it's hard to compete with a million writers and just whatever turns out to be the funny joke that day. But, there are all sorts of horrendously funny things that are said that are hilarious. And when you look at what they do, it's not like they have a history in France and Paris, but I don't understand that they're a big presence in French humor. They're ignored most of the time until they offend somebody, and so I think that says a lot about them. And so I know they're not racist. I know they're not hateful, but they
do a crap job at humor.
If that's what they're after, if they're trying to be comedians or satirists, certainly they don't care about being popular. But even if they care just about being understood, that's what they're doing for a living, I do think it's problematic looking at them and just thinking, why are you doing that? Like, what is it you want? If people don't even get at some point that, that your intent is humor, decades long history, deep tradition in French satire, and yet people don't understand.
Yeah. Understood. I'll let you go. I'll let you get ready for the Parks and Rec reunion. Just kidding. You and Adam Scott, the golfer. But Ben Schwartz, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Thank you for having me, Gil.
And that was Ben Schwartz. His journalism's a blast, and I'm really looking forward to his book on American humor between the wars. Like I said, I also enjoyed the heck out of his unproduced screenplay about Bob Hope, Home by Christmas. To find out more and to check out Ben's work overall, visit benschwartzy.com. And that's BenSchwartzy. Ben Schwartzy is also his Twitter handle, so you should follow him there. If you just search for Ben Schwartz, you may wind up with the guy who played John Ralphio on Parks and Rec. Very different person. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Ben, so, who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. You can do that at patreon.com or at paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, the series of ebooks I swear to God I'm going to launch this summer, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, this episode was the last one for my LA trip in June, which led into a San Diego trade show. So I didn't pay for air travel, but I did pay for rental car, hotel, and parking in LA. And that piled up. That was pretty expensive. Food and coffee were pretty negligible because I eat cheap, but it was a hit. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like travel, equipment, and web hosting, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Kevin Katila, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David has a reunion project going with his great 80s band David and David, and you can find out more and support that at facebook.com/davidanddavidmusic. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with the great cartoonist Ellen Forney. Till next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and at YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Till next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.